Hey, Cypher here. When talking about how the US expanded westward, we tend to think of old fur trappers, Indian wars, mineral rushes, cattle drives, homesteaders, railroads, and lawless gunfights. Indeed, that list of things practically defines the entire Western genre, but something we rarely think of when speaking of the frontier is how it was mapped. Map-making seems decidedly undramatic, unless you ask Emperor Tigerstar. But it was the backbone of not only US expansion, but also American capitalism today, including our entire property system itself. The infrastructure of our economy was built on a series of expeditions which were anything if not dramatic. In fact, we can thank Army expeditions for the creation of this republic in and of itself. Heck, even the engineering discipline came from the Army. No American is untouched by the effects of this history, yet it's largely forgotten because these were mostly peaceful and therefore lacking the easily romanticized nature of conflict. So let's change that. From the early days of exploration, these were military affairs. Army expeditions were not merely fact-finding missions with nerdy engineers, they were some of the greatest adventures of their times, and were of tremendous importance, from how George Washington began his career to John C. Fremont conquering California. For a brief time prior to the Civil War, the Army created a corps of topographical engineers meant specifically for this task. During Reconstruction, they morphed into semi-private expeditions and were finally consolidated into the US Geographic Survey, taking all that knowledge gained from the previous century of adventures and fostering the bountiful way we live today. So this is the oft-forgotten tale of how the Army mapped everything and made America. This episode is part of a big HistoryTuber collaboration called Project Exploration, dedicated to, well, the history of exploration. So, if you're not already on the playlist, hop on there already. It's a great topic. If you are on there, well, I've got a hell of a story for y'all today. Let's talk about how engineering, infrastructure, property, capitalism, and even the Republic as a whole has Army exploring expeditions to thank for their existence. I can't cover everything, and this is quite a sweeping history, so be sure to check out my bibliography to get further into this. I especially recommend this book, Army Exploration in the American West, 1803 to 1863. It is vitally important to this tale, and the most important of those in the bibliography. And it actually kind of changed the way that we think about military history in the West in general. So it's got some historiographic importance as well, because as you can tell from that bibliography, this is a massive topic. This episode is sponsored by patrons like Kevin Butler and Brilliant. It's a skills development website that uses interactive challenges to teach. For example, every research question needs to start with a search, and becoming competent in using online search engines is imperative to that skill. Well, Brilliant has a course specifically for that. Each challenge builds on one another to the point that you will eventually understand the back end of how these systems function. Having just taught a class that spent an entire week on how to do exactly that, I can confirm getting the fundamentals down is absolutely necessary. It allows you to discover what is already done on a given subject, especially the miscellaneous items that may not show up when you simply search. So learning how a thesaurus helps or when to use special parameters can vastly increase your ability to explore a topic. That's where Brilliant can help. They have a bunch of courses meant to develop your problem-solving skills in such topics as math, science, and coding. You'll solve challenges and advance your competence through this interactive format. They tell a story to keep you engaged and powering through the difficult spots. The first 200 to go to the link below, which is brilliant.org/thecynicalhistorian, will get 20% off an annual premium subscription. And there's many more courses to explore. Anyways, on with the show. In the British colonies of the East Coast, in order to designate who owned what property, which was of course the driving factor of colonization, it was necessary to map everything. Surveyors were chiefly untrained people who were semi-literate. They'd get a private appointment to travel westward and survey the land to make a map that would later be divvied up. This kind of map making was the work of empire, creating the blueprint for settlers to expand a colony deeper westward. In doing so, they inherently displaced the indigenous peoples of their land. It was a long and complicated process of a century and a half, but suffice it to say, it involved great violence. As such, surveyors increasingly needed to be the spear point of imperial growth, so they often gained commissions in either the militia of that colony or the royal army. Of these non-professional surveyors turned commissioned officers was a young George Washington. The British and French empires disputed the Ohio Territory. Furs were plentiful, land waited for abundant agriculture, and rivers were ready to carry trade all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. Of course, King Louis and King George wanted Ohio for themselves. Never mind the various tribes who comprised it, settler colonists would steadily displace them like everywhere else in the colonies. So Washington was one of the first British colonists to start surveying the area in 1752. He took a commission in the Virginia militia in order to do this. He found the source of the Ohio River and rafted its treacherous waters. But France was moving into the valley faster than Britain. They defeated a British attempt to create a fur fort at Pickawillany and built their own instead. With tensions rising, Virginia sent Washington once again in 1754 to demand that the French withdraw from the Ohio. The world would tremble in the wake of that decision. His expedition came upon a French patrol and massacred them. Knowing the terrain from his previous expedition, they constructed a fort and called it Necessity. After an abortive raid on the French fort, Washington's expedition got besieged and easily defeated. They were sent back home in shame for what he'd done. But this was a match to kindling, and began the French and Indian War, which eventually spread across the globe a couple years later, igniting the 7 Years' War. It was a truly global conflict, and it began with George Washington getting a commission as a surveyor. Britain triumphed, gaining tremendous amounts of territory, but at great cost. Her treasury had doubled in debt. Yet the colonists were equally indebted, if not more so. They had almost nothing to show for it, too. Because of a subsequent attempt by Ohio-based tribes to push white settlers back to the sea, King George proclaimed that the colonies were limited to a line along the Appalachians and could expand no further. From these grievances, colonists began to distrust their motherland. Britain would worsen that. Without representation in Parliament, colonists increasingly faced taxation to pay for the war. They were barred from enjoying its triumph. From 1763 to 1775, these tensions worsened until a protest against an imperial tea monopoly angered Parliament enough to pass what Bostonians called the Intolerable Acts. They rebelled. That insurrection spread from the other 13 colonies, who backed it with an entire army, led by none other than George Washington again. And once the French finally joined to avenge their loss a decade prior, the newly declared United States defeated Britain and assured her independence. Like Cincinnatus of legend, Washington returned to his plantation, happy to allow the fledgling republic to distinguish itself without his powerful excursions. The Ohio Valley, where Washington began all of this, continued to play a pivotal role. From his and many other military surveys, the Congress of Confederation was able to make a modicum of income, despite its inherently weakened status. They designated all of the land north of the Ohio River as the Northwest Territory in 1787, claiming that it would be divided into quarter sections of 160 acres apiece. That year, the Confederation Congress would begin to dissolve in favor of our current Constitution, but the Northwest Ordinance would be one of the few laws carried over into the new regime. Heading that regime was none other than George Washington again, who arose like Cincinnatus upon the call of Americans everywhere to take up the mantle and lead the United States' newly created federal government. In honor of such propitious personalities, a new frontier town was renamed to symbolize the new president and his order of veteran officers who returned to normal life: Cincinnati. In case the association was unclear, the nearby fort was named Washington. The problem was, the various tribes there wanted the pre-1776 border. The British had negotiated the Fort Stanwix Treaty with the Iroquois Confederacy, which set the area south of the Ohio River as territory available for white settlement. Cincinnati was north of the river, but the U.S. had negotiated another border with the Iroquois in 1784. Problem was, they didn't actually represent the tribes they claimed dominion over, and subsequent purchases were also unrepresentative. But surveys began anyways, led by Army officers, in order to establish title and create those quarter sections of the Northwest Ordinance. Of course, Miamis and Shawnee Indians attacked the surveyors they saw as infringing on their territory, partially in retaliation for a low-level war with Kentuckian frontiersmen that already existed, setting off a series of raids and counter-raids that spiraled out of control. Tribes in the Northwest Territory formed a makeshift confederacy, and were actually winning the war at first, having killed around 1,500 whites before 1790. So the military governor of Ohio sent an expedition, which lost. So he personally led another expedition and faced the worst defeat in U.S. history. His name was Arthur St. Clair, and the Continental Army had to reform in the wake of this, creating the current U.S. Army, becoming the first officially organized military force under the new federal government in 1792. The Navy came a few years later, the Marines were never fully split off, and revenue cutters, later Coast Guard, didn't establish military ranks until 2 years after the Navy. So this Northwest Indian War created the U.S. Army out of miserable defeat, which became the basis for all the rest of the military today. The Army eventually won and took all of Ohio, finally granting Washington the victory he'd sought for 3 decades. But surveying remained a haphazard affair, where unprofessional mapping continued and was only partly helped along by Army commissions. In 1802, the U.S. Military Academy began at West Point, New York. This became the first engineering school in the fledgling republic, and it was the nucleus for all engineering programs elsewhere. If you are an engineer in the United States, or rely on them in any way, which is basically every American, then you've got the U.S. Army to thank for that. West Point allowed for the professionalization of survey expeditions, and the Army took over in an official capacity just in time for the U.S. to expand massively. In 1803, President Jefferson's administration negotiated the Louisiana Purchase just a year after West Point's creation. So Jefferson needed expeditions to map out the new territory. Each one would organize private scouts, scientists, and frontiersmen under commissioned officers, setting a pattern that would last for 7 decades. The Army began mapping America. The first was put together under Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. Their Corps of Discovery traveled from St. Louis across the Great Plains and Rocky Mountains, went all the way to the Pacific coast, and returned, mapping the entire route and having many adventures along the way. These expeditions hired scouts to guide them through such unknown terrain, especially indigenous locals, and the Corps of Discovery got one of the most famous, Sacagawea. Despite giving birth along the way, she managed to save some of the expedition's vital equipment when everything was falling apart during some river rapids. She was also helpful as an interpreter. Each tribe they met on that path, they'd try to establish trade and good relations, and were surprisingly successful. They studied the local fauna and published the story of their journey for all to read. The next couple of expeditions were less fortunate. General James Wilkinson was actually a Spanish spy, despite being the highest-ranking officer in the army. He betrayed the 2 expeditions that went to survey the southern and middle portions of the Purchase. One went along the Red River, and Spanish troops turned them back around present-day New Boston, Texas. Then there was the expedition under Zebulon Pike. Some soldiers caught his party near the headwaters of the Rio Grande in the San Luis Valley of modern-day Colorado. They captured the expedition and escorted them south, confiscating most of their gear. Luckily, the Spaniards were kind enough to allow Pike and crew to keep their notes and treated them well all the way through Nuevo Mexico and Coahuila. Eventually, they came back safe and published their findings anyways, but only after some intense negotiations in 1807. After such embarrassments, and another costly war with Britain that made the US need to focus on creating our own independent manufacturing might, The Madison administration sought to use the engineering power of the Army internally instead of exploring borders. With the new road technology of macadamization, the Army Corps of Engineers mapped out a new national road, starting in 1810. They would also help engineer several key canals and railroads too, becoming the backbone of the emerging market revolution throughout the 1810s, 20s, and 30s, when America became a capitalist country. Especially important among these economic maps was the Mississippi. It was destined to become the great commercial corridor for further westward expansion. By 1814, there were already 21 steamboats on the Mississippi. There'd be 1,200 by 1833. So the Army sent Stephen Harriman Long to scout out the river in 1817. He successfully mapped it to modern-day St. Paul, Minnesota. Long joined Henry Atkinson to map the Missouri River all the way to the mouth of the Yellowstone River, but failed to reach their goal, and Long split off on his own for the rest of the Great Plains in 1820. They did set up the first U.S. fort on the western Great Plains, and Atkinson would complete their goal 5 years later, but Long's split was more important. He mapped out much of the Rocky Mountains and several key parts of the plains. His maps would be integral for pioneers crossing what Long erroneously dubbed the Great American Desert. He only saw the plains as a thing to pass through on people's journeys towards Oregon. On his findings, some merchants would also begin the Santa Fe Trail a year later. His expedition solidified the newly negotiated border, originally between Spain and the US starting in 1819, and then Mexico after they gained independence. Throughout the 1820s and early 30s, Army engineers mostly focused on building up the nation's infrastructure. Congress tasked them with surveying the country for good transport routes in 1824. Army engineers assisted the Navy as they began surveying the coast. Dockyard and lighthouse construction came under Army engineers, eventually subsumed by the Navy and becoming the basis of construction battalions in the 1930s that are now known as the Seabees. The Army didn't do another major exploratory expedition until 1833 under Benjamin Bonneville, which covered much of the route into Oregon and allowed for a series of trails into that territory and Alta California. Under the 1824 General Survey Act, a French engineer named Joseph Nicollet immigrated to the US and began a survey of the Mississippi in 1836. He'd make 3 more expeditions, and the second one would be under the auspices of a new command, the Corps of Topographical Engineers. They split from all the other kinds of engineers because of the need to have a clear group of explorers. Essentially, this small group of officers were put together specifically to systematize exploration. This meant no more needing to make specific provisions for each and every expedition. They were all under one unified structure that allowed for easier logistics, a normalized code for maps, specific data for everyone to gather, and a quick route for publishing each survey. Nicollet was the first commander. Unfortunately, he got sick in 1840 and died before he could publish his findings in 1843. But his apprentice, who also had French heritage, would take up the mantle and become a rising star in the Corps. John C. Fremont didn't go through West Point, which would be a major source of consternation, but he studied well under Nicollet. For all these expeditions to happen, politicians had to sponsor them, and none were greater patrons of westward expansion than Thomas Hart Benton. He and Fremont got along well until Fremont eloped with his daughter, Jessie. But they eventually made up, and Jessie became an integral part of Fremont's survey work. Senator Benton sent him on an expedition to Oregon country to distract from the drama with his daughter, but also to create better maps of the trail there for pioneers. It was a smash hit despite several mishaps along the way. Fremont wasn't a professional engineer, but Jessie helped him write, weaving the story into quite the adventure. So he set out again, intending to go south from Oregon to map the northern border of Alta California. Despite almost having his trusty scout, Kit Carson, quit and losing a cannon in the Sierra Nevadas, he got all the way to Sutter's Fort, where Sacramento is today. Even more daring, he headed south and then northeast across the desert, discovering that the Intermountain West contains a great basin with no outlet. He disproved once and for all that there was no hidden, fantastic river all the way from the Rockies. If that wasn't superlative enough, his third expedition would change the world. He He ended back in California, but this time antagonized the locals so much so that they ended up besieging him for a week until his flag fell down in the wind and he went scurrying away. So he was back up in Oregon territory for a bit, until a Marine lieutenant came with a message from President Polk. Fremont probably misinterpreted it, but in either case, he returned and fomented a revolution. The Bear Flag Revolt sprang from immigrants at Sutter's Fort, who decided to rebel against the semi-autonomous Alta California government, basically at Fremont's urging. They began by taking the barracks in Sonoma and rallying many to their cause to have the US annex Alta California after so many years of strange autonomy from Mexico. Once Fremont and the Pacific Squadron joined, they easily conquered California. Fremont stubbornly refused to relinquish power to his superior, General Kearny, when he arrived. That old non-West Point rivalry kept Fremont proud, so he ended up returning east in chains. Fremont would have a long career with such issues, despite resigning after his court-martial. Nonetheless, he had delivered California to America just in time to be added to the other takings from the Mexican-American War, and that soon proved to be a godsend. During Fremont's second expedition, he had named the entry to the San Francisco Bay the Golden Gate, for all the gold he assumed would eventually flow into California once their settlements developed. Instead, much gold would flow out. Mere weeks before the ratification of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, an outlying mill worker from Sutter's Fort found gold in the stream. Once Polk acknowledged the discovery, a year later, a massive gold rush began, guaranteeing California's swift entry into the Union and setting off a decade-long clash over slavery with the Compromise of 1850.
The Compromise of 1850.
That sectional crisis ended in the Civil War. Fremont would play an integral part, becoming one of California's first senators and being the first Republican presidential candidate with a much clearer anti-slavery stance than Lincoln 4 years later. He was even the first to proclaim emancipation during the war. But during the sectional crisis, the Corps of Topographical Engineers were quite busy in Fremont's absence. Even before 1846, they had begun two major projects that would carry into the 1850s. One was the Lake Survey, trying to map out the Great Lakes accurately enough for any future commerce and canals. They started in 1841 and didn't get everything done until 1882. At the same time, they started surveying boundaries between states and neighboring countries. After 1848, they had to settle where the new border was. The map used for the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was faulty, so the border was uncertain. It was a rather unsettled region, with only two extant communities along it, those being Doña Ana and Santa Rita. Apaches and bandits made the survey quite difficult. A sudden influx of people moving into La Mesilla, founded in 1849, and Las Cruces in 1850, meant the border could cut through these new towns. New Mexico's new governor even declared Mesilla was in American territory, contrary to Army surveyors. Worse still, filibusters and Amerindian raiders into Mexico were ruining any semblance of following the treaty. To fix all of this, the U.S. negotiated annexing the area south of the Gila River. The land of the Gadsden Purchase, also known as Gastonia in the 1850s, included Tucson and guaranteed Mesilla was American, despite it being created as a refuge for those fleeing American territory. The treaty also ended obligations to stop Apache and Comanche raiding. Now Army engineers could complete the survey of the border and make first contact with a bunch of new tribes. The end of that survey dovetailed into the most sweeping survey in American history. Numerous expeditions launched in 1853 to find routes across the West for railroads. Through this, the Corps of Topographical Engineers explored much of the Trans-Mississippi West, highlighting several possible routes. The results got bogged down in the sectional crisis, though. Whether a transcontinental railroad went north or south could give power to slave or free states. The Secretary of War was Jefferson Davis at the time, and he used his power to conclude in favor of the South. But the outbreak of the Civil War would ultimately favor a central route, Either way, the Corps kept exploring the West. They put markers down along the Canadian border, laid out new wagon roads all over, and started going up the Colorado River with the Whipple and Ives expeditions. They enabled numerous mineral discoveries and movement to those locations. They did incredible work that continues to affect us to this day. But when the Civil War began, these surveys ground to a halt. Halfway through the war, the Corps of Topographical Engineers was disbanded. Yet there was still work to be done, but it would lack that organization that systematized survey work and mapped the entire US in just a few decades, and created the economic impetus for continual growth. Instead, survey expeditions fell back on the old way of doing things from before the Corps. They'd organize a haphazard group under a commander and sponsored by a political benefactor. Because it was piecemeal, 4 different teams worked on covering the remaining blank spots on the map, led by Clarence King, Ferdinand Vanderveer Hayden, John Wesley Powell, and George Wheeler. Powell's boating down the Green and Colorado rivers is the stuff of legend, but for the most part, these surveys were simply filling the gaps left by the Railroad Survey. They were unfortunately not unified and often overlapping one another, essentially functioning as 4 roving bands of topographers. They still had adventures like so many before, but it lacked the structure of the Corps. So much so that a different expedition from these 4 caused a major issue. George Armstrong Custer led an expedition to map out the Black Hills and discovered gold. He was under orders from President Grant to keep any such find secret, but he let it leak, sparking off a gold rush, which eventually led to Lakotas trying to halt such blatant violations of their reservation. Custer ended up in this Great Sioux War and got surrounded with his 7th Cavalry, losing badly at Little Bighorn. This was a serious embarrassment for the Army, especially since it was near the nation's centennial celebrations. Either way, the Army did eventually win the Great Sioux War, but these kinds of expeditions clearly needed to be reorganized like the Topographical Corps, but under civilian authorities. Didn't want to have another Custer incident on their hands. So the Department of the Interior created the Geological Survey, reorganizing the 4 ongoing surveys under one clear organization and standardizing the entire map of the United States in 1879. The first director was Clarence King, and the second John Wesley Powell. The USGS consolidated all of the findings from the previous century of professional survey work, and remain an integral part of how we map America today. The Army was no longer mapping and exploring America, but they managed to do it quite well while they had control of it. The country had formed on survey work. Westward expansion was based on exploratory mapping, and the system of property beginning with the Northwest Ordinance spread across the nation with the same quarter-section plots from sea to sea. West Point created engineering as a profession and centered the surveying power on Army topographers. They mapped the nation and secured her infrastructure. Our republic, property system, engineering profession, infrastructure, and economic prowess all have U.S. Army explorers to thank. Just as I start recording. Yes. You really have to do that right there, don't you? Meow. 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 Well, why are you being such a nuisance then if you don't want to be held? Hmm? Meow. 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 Well, don't fall, stupid.